Good day, everybody. My name is Jason Stella, and this is the Lifetime Training Podcast, and I have the one and only Mr. Greg Roskopf today. You are not going to want to miss this episode. Greg's the founder of Muscle Activation Technique. He's the biomechanics specialist for the Denver Broncos for over 23 years, worked with teams like the Utah Jazz, the Denver Nuggets, many others, and most recently has just been on fire with our golf champion, Bryson Deshambo. So welcome to the show, Greg.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Good to be here.
Yeah, man. And it's been so good to see you again, man. Like I said, I went through the 5th internship. God, that would have been probably like 2001 or 2002 sometime back then. And just, you know, really you've changed my career. And I've always said that going through the internship has always been something that if, you know, the certain jobs I've had with the different companies, if that ever went south, I could always pick up and, you know, fairly quickly get back on my feet financially just by being an MAT specialist. So, you know, I know a lot of people, you know who you are. There's a lot of people that don't. And I would love for you to just kind of share your story of kind of how you came to, you know, developing this technique and specifically what it is.
All right. So basically, I mean, the foundation is MAT deals with the muscle system's role in chronic pain and injury. And it all started, 30 years ago. I was going on a quest because when I was 19, I had a fractured vertebrae and had a lot of residual problems. I went on, finished college. I had to sacrifice my last year of eligibility in football because of my back issues. And I got a job as a strength and conditioning coach at Fresno State in California, and just dealing with a lot of issues and working in the field as a strength coach, getting my master's degree with an emphasis in exercise science. I always dealt with the muscle system, but I was in chronic pain. And so the residual issues after having the fractured vertebrae, due to compensation and adaptation, and next thing you know, I had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction. Literally one injury after another. And by the time I was 25 years old, I'm sitting here, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? And so I started seeking out specialists and again, working in the field, it kind of led me into I was dealing with the medical staff at Fresno State and it led me into some right connections early on to help me try and figure out my issues. But the interesting thing was that I was learning from some of the top specialists in the country. Back then, Gary Gray's the king of function, and he's been the king of function. I met him and learned from him over 30 years ago. Wow. And I was one of the first non-physical therapists that allowed in his classes at the time. And so had unique opportunities early on and was able to learn from some very knowledgeable physical therapists. And if you understand Gary Gray, he knows biomechanics and always looks at the interrelationships of joints and how the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, all the way to the occiput are all interrelated. And so as I started to learn from Gary Gray and having the opportunity to work with a physical therapist in Fresno, whose name was Richard Jackson, he was a physical therapist that dealt with spine mechanics, but also looked at the interrelationships of joint. And it was kind of ironic because early on, when I was having some back issues, I had this Richard Jackson check me out, and he mobilized my big toe. and he mobilized my big toe, and my back pain was gone for a day. And I'm like, how can my big toe have anything to do with my back pain? And he opened my eyes to this whole interrelationship of joints and how pain is not necessarily where the problem is, and that you have to understand this biomechanical system. So I went down that path, and that's why I sought out Gary Gray and other people that I was learning from. Basically, everyone I sought out, I wanted to make sure they were teaching from a biomechanical perspective and in a related perspective. And so I had great opportunities learning from some great people early on in my career. And I sought out people, specialists in chiropractic, physical therapy, podiatry, understanding foot mechanics and its relationship to total body movement, and to massage, to exercise specialists. And the interesting thing was the common denominator from every specialty that I was learning from focused on the fact that, I mean, muscle tightness is the cause of most of the problems. If you have restricted motion in one joint, it's going to put increased stress on other joints and tissues. And it made so much sense. And as I had these top specialists work with me, learning from them and also working with me, the interesting component was that everyone, basically every modality focused on trying to loosen up tight tissues. Yep. But the problem was every time I would stretch or get deep tissue massage, I couldn't get out of bed the next day. I'd have numbness and sciatica down into my big toe. And I'm like, I mean, I was literally like, man, what's wrong with me? I understand the interrelationships of joints and how the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, all the way to the occiput are interrelated. And if you have abnormal motion in one joint or tissue, it's going to put increased stress on other joints and tissue. I just understood this whole complex system, but it wasn't working for me. And then there were some other people that I worked with, some athletes and clients that I'd have that, I mean, most people would do really well, and the others, it's like they didn't respond as well. And I kind of kind of pulled them under my wing because I wanted to know why certain people responded well and others didn't. And so I knew there was a missing link. And literally, like I said, I was 25 years old saying, man, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? And so I needed to find answers. And so then I took a step back and realized, I mean, kind of looked at it from the perspective of why am I so tight? I understand that tightness can be the cause of all these compensation patterns and abnormal stresses, but why am I so tight? And if you think about it, I took the perspective like when you walk on ice. The first thing you do when you walk on ice is you tighten up as a protective mechanism. So the natural neurological response is when the body senses instability, it will tighten up as a protective mechanism. So I took a step back, and it was a perfect time in my life because at this point in time, I'd been hired by the Utah Jazz through the end of the Stockton Malone era. And I'm the biomechanics, functional movement, range of motion king at the time. I put together this unique process that all dealt with the interrelationships of joints and how abnormal motion in one joint and tissue can put increased stress on others. And I had stretching and exercise programs tied in with everything that I did. And I was hired by the Utah Jazz at this point. And I had the opportunity to work with the team chiropractor for the Utah Jazz, Dr. Craig Bueller, who specializes in clinical kinesiology. And Craig Bueller did manual muscle testing. And so, I mean, in any applied and clinical kinesiology, they do manual muscle testing. And so I'd been exposed to it in my career, but I never really knew how it fit with what I was doing, or never found a place to make it fit with what I was doing. And so we would work together. Every time I'd fly to Utah, we'd work together, and I'd do my range of motion assessment, and I'd start identifying where, say, Stockton would have some limitations in range of motion, and I was doing all different modalities that I had learned from these specialists to try and increase mobility. And then I'd follow up with strengthening exercises to help reinforce the work that I was doing. And it worked great in professional sports. But then we're working with Bueller. He's doing this manual muscle testing. And it was interesting because there was one time that I was working on John Stockton, and he had performed his manual muscle testing and checked checked strength in the hips, and John was fine. And I started working on him and saw that he was limited in internal rotation in one of his hips. And so I did the stretching techniques and mobility work. And by the time I was done, Craig Bueller came back. I mean, his range of motion increased pretty dramatically, but Bueller came back and found that he was weak in an area that I had just opened up his ranges of motion. And he literally looked at me and said, "What did you just do?" And I'm thinking about it.
Like, oh shit!
I hear those words in my head still today. And I'm like, I just opened up a range of motion, and now he was weak where he had been strong prior. And that didn't make, I'm like, that can't be good. Like, the last thing we want to do is make somebody weak when we're administering whatever we're doing, and as a therapeutic modality, if you want to say. Yeah. And so that stuck in me. And so I started, I mean, it's like, I got to look deeper into what I'm doing. And so my focus up to this point was functional training combined with range of motion, find out where the isolated limitations and range of motion are and address those limitations. And so I started playing around with manual muscle testing. I got all the books from who Alan Beardall created clinical kinesiology. So I got all the tests that Bueller had been doing through Alan Beardall, who he worked with directly. And so one of the interesting things was that in the manual muscle testing in clinical kinesiology and applied kinesiology, most of the tests are tests in mid-ranges of motion because that's where we have the mechanical advantage. So they're looking at it if we have weaknesses, if you find a weakness, it's going to show up where the muscle should be the strongest. Well, the interesting part was as I started playing around with the manual muscle testing, I'd test some muscles in mid-range and they'd be strong. But because I was a range of motion guy and all my whole career up to this point was focusing on identifying, like doing range of motion assessment and identifying where limitations in range of motions were, I started changing a lot of the tests. And so like, I mean, if they were testing hip rotation, they would test it from a neutral position in internal and external rotation, and you would test to see if the rotators were strong under the applied or clinical kinesiology format. Where I would say, what if happens if I test the muscle in the extreme of range of motion? So let's say external rotation of the humerus. What happens if I test it in this position rather than mid-range in this position? And so all of a sudden I'd find that in mid-range, there would be, I'd find strong tests, but in the extreme of range of motion, that's when I'd find weak tests. And the interesting correlation was that because I was a range of motion guy, wherever I would see a limitation in range of motion, I would test to see, are they strong in that position? So take that example when John Stockton was limited in hip internal rotation at 90 degrees of hip flexion and knee flexion, he was limited in range of motion and hip internal rotation. So I tested him in the range that I could take him to, that I assessed his range of motion exam. And this is at another time. And all of a sudden, correlating with the limitation in range of motion, I started finding that there was always a protective tightness, or a weakness. So the idea was that the body was protecting the muscles from shortening or moving into their extremes of range of motion. And so tightness was actually a sign of weakness. And so I go back to that statement I made earlier, is that when you walk on ice, the natural neurological response is when the body senses instability, it tightens up as a protective mechanism. And so then this tightness, the reason how many times I think anyone can look and say, how many times do you take your clients and you stretch them over and over and over, and they stretch day after day, they're doing their home stretches, and they come back and they're just as tight as they were 6 months or a year ago. And the reason is because you've never melted the ice. When the body senses instability, it will tighten up as a protective mechanism. So I took a paradigm shift in my thought process and recognized that the instability issue was an intrinsic mechanism rather than an external surface, like we walking on ice versus instability through the neuromuscular system. Well, instability, what does that mean to us? I mean, we think of, core stability, scapular stability. I mean, we think of stability and we think of stability in neutral. Like, I'm going to hold my spine in a spinal neutral position, then I'm going to lift my leg and lift my arm so I have good core stability. Or I'm going to balance on an unstable surface, whether I'm standing or from a scapular standpoint, I'm going to create scapular stability. What it really comes down to is stability. You need stability through motion. We don't function in neutral. And so basically it's the extremes of range of motion that the body tries to protect itself from going into when it senses instability. And so what does that mean? I'm thinking, well, that means muscle weakness because I'm doing manual muscle testing and I'm finding out that people are weak in these extremes of range of motion. And it's well, but I was strong. I was bench pressing 400 pounds, squatting 500 pounds. And I'm like, well, you can't tell me I'm weak. Like at this point in time in my life, you can't tell me I'm weak. but I had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction. I mean, I had elbow pain, neck pain. I had one injury after another. And what I realized was that I was actually seeking out external forms of stability where I was wrapping my knees when I would squat. I'd wear a weight belt. I'd have elbow wraps when I was benching, and I had orthotics to stabilize my feet. And
you didn't wear the shirt? No bench press shirt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I literally was realizing that, I mean, I was strong, but I was unstable. And there are different motor units that have to be recruited in order to create stability versus create strength and force output. And so I was strong, but I was unstable. And the best analogy I could use is if you were to open a door and you grab the handle and you open the door, I mean, due to mechanics, I mean, the farther away from you are from the axis, I mean, you're going to be able to freely open that door, and basically the door is spinning on the hinges. Well, imagine if somebody came in and loosened all the screws or loosened your lug nuts on your tire. It's like you open the door and it would be all rackety, or the tires are going to wear abnormally on when you have loose lug nuts. So when you don't have the stabilizers, the stabilizing muscles doing their job to hold joints in proper alignment, and you're still producing torque, I mean, the joints are getting all abnormally stressed because you don't have a stable base or a stable axis to move from. And so that's when I realized that you can have strength, but that doesn't mean you have stability. And so working forward through that idea is basically recognizing the fact that whenever you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And I always say it's like having loose battery cables, where the brain sends the message, but the muscles just don't fire the way they're designed to fire. It's like there's a dimmer switch, or I mean, there's basically the input's not getting there. Yeah. And so, and this idea is inflammation causes these altered communication pathways. And inflammation negatively affects the contractile ability or the metabolic characteristics of the slow twitch muscle fibers. So slow twitch muscle fibers are negatively impacted by inflammation. And the main key behind that is slow twitch muscle fibers. They're basically the muscles that have the lowest threshold to activation. They're the muscle fibers that provide stability to joints and maintain upright posture. So the slow twitch muscle fibers, because they have the lowest threshold to activation, they're the fibers that actually fire and fired on demand beyond our conscious control. There's the interesting, I mean, beyond our conscious control, these muscles are firing and we don't even know it.
That's amazing.
And so it's slow twitch muscle fibers are negatively affected by inflammation. Inflammation changes the metabolic characteristics of the slow twitch muscle fibers where they become fast twitch in nature, which means the threshold, the main fact is the threshold to activation gets higher. And the fatigability, and you lose your oxidative capacity. So the muscle, you're going to fatigue at a lot. The muscles are going to fatigue at a much faster rate. But the main part is that the threshold to activation gets higher, which means it takes more electrical current before the muscles can fire and contract. There's the instability issue, is muscles have to contract and contract on demand. When you have inflammation and these slow twitch fibers start to pick up fast twitch characteristics, that's like having the loose battery cables. The brain sends a message, but the muscles just don't get the input, so they can't fire on demand, which means then they can't do their job to stabilize joints and protect you from injury. There's our instability issue. Inflammation creates an instability issue through our neuromuscular system. And that's when muscles can't do their job to protect us from injury. And the ironic part is probably getting ahead of the game here, because there's an inverse relationship between mechanoreception and nociception, which is basically saying that when the muscles can't fire, it's a sensory input issue, where you can't provide proper input to the central nervous system to create proper motor output. So there's this communication issue that is negatively affected. But when muscles get weaker and they can't do their job to tolerate force due to this decreased mechanoreceptive input, then the sensitivity of your nociceptors or your pain receptors increases. So it takes less physical stress to create a pain response. And so the interesting thing is when you have decreased input or when you have inflammation, I mean, you think about what is one of the signs and symptoms of inflammation? Pain. And so when you have inflammation, muscles can't do their job to contract and stabilize joints, but they can't do, but it also sensitizes the nociceptors. So because the muscles are weaker, it takes less physical stress to create a pain response. So what I started realizing was that, man, it seems that, I mean, when people have weaknesses, they have pain. When clients would come into me and complain of pain, there was always associated always associated weaknesses that came with the pain. But the interesting thing is, even before the pain sets in, is there were limitations in range of motion. So the first sign of muscle dysfunction is limitations in range of motion. The second sign is pain. Its body shouts out in pain saying, quit putting force on me until you fix the problem. So a big point on this is that when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten effectively. And when a muscle can't shorten effectively, the opposite muscles won't lengthen effectively. So the opposite muscles show up as being tight. Through reciprocal inhibition, when a muscle contracts, the opposite muscle has to relax to allow you to move through the full range of motion. But when you have inhibition of associated muscle, you lose the ability for that muscle to fully shorten, and the opposite muscle no longer gets the reciprocal inhibition input, so that muscle shows up as being tight. I spent my whole career focusing on tightness. And then with myself, if I didn't have the personal issues of the fractured vertebrae and the resultant tightness that never got resolved through stretching and massage and different type of modalities that focused on the tightness, I would have never went down this path. And the interesting thing was, I mean, I was tight. I could barely bend to touch my knees, let alone my toes years after having my fractured vertebrae. And after I kind of started implementing these principles and recognizing that wherever you see a limitation in range of motion, it means that one or more of the muscles that move you into that position can't contract efficiently, which is causing protective tightness on the antagonist side of that axis. And so the first time I had somebody work with me, my weaknesses showed up in my hip flexors and abdominals. My tightness was in my hamstrings and erector spinae muscles. I'd stretch my hamstrings. I would stretch to death and never get any more flexible. And then the first time I got my hip flexors and abdominals activated, I reached down and touched my toes for the first time in 10 years. And I literally melted the ice. And the interesting thing was I haven't tightened back up since. I can still touch my toes and I haven't stretched since. Now all I do is make sure that the muscles that move me there can contract efficiently. And so you think about where the body protects itself from the extremes of range of motion. It tightens up and says, "Ooh, I'm not going to let you go into end range of external rotation. I'm not going to let you turn to the right, or I'm not going to let you turn to the left, or I'm not going to let you bend down and touch your toes." Because when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten effectively, which means those extremes of range of motion represent a position of instability. So the body tightens up to not allow you to move into the position where the body's unstable. And it's the extremes of range of motion that are where we're unstable. So you think about one main factor on there is conventional stability training is designed to create stability in a neutral position. We don't function in neutral. And where do we revert to when we are dysfunctional? Like when we walk on ice and the body senses instability, we tighten up and we basically revert ourselves toward our center of gravity. We revert to neutral. Neutral is the position where we're the strongest. The extremes of range of motion in every joint and movement and tissue is where the muscles, where dysfunction will show up. And it's also where tightness shows up. So like I said, the first sign of muscle dysfunction and weakness is tightness. The second sign is the body shouting out in pain, saying, "Quit moving me in that position under load," or "Quit putting forces on me until you fix the problem."
Wow.
So it was a whole evolution and a paradigm shift in thought process that I was a range of motion functional movement guy. And then it's shifted all the way over to this understanding that the integrated system is only as good as the function of its isolated parts. And so movement by movement, muscle by muscle, we had to break it down into its isolated parts.
Well, and the awareness is what comes to my mind. The awareness that you've had to understand and look at those little things, as opposed to how many people would just, stretch and continue to do it and not pay attention, and how you've been able to take everything from all the people that you've learned and put it into your unique system, which is obviously what's unique about MAT. So many things. I was writing some notes just to talk about. I remember a personal story is when I was sitting towards the front of, maybe it was like the second weekend course, and I had battled from, I had plantar, or I started with Achilles tendonitis playing college basketball, and then somebody put me in orthotics, and it jumped from Achilles tendonitis to patellar tendonitis, and then by the time I was actually in your cert, there was my third pair of orthotics, and it jumped to a really bad plantar fasciitis. So only Achilles, patellar, then plantar, and it was terrible. And I remember you grabbing me off, putting me in front of the group on the table. So let me test some stuff, and started looking at my feet, and everything was just shut down. You said, take the orthotics out. Let me work on you again. And you worked on me, and you said, okay, run up and down, the hallway. And I ran up and down the hallway. I came back and you tested again. My feet were great. He said, okay, just hang tight. And then you went and lectured. Then about an hour later, you came back. Let me test you again. It was still fine. And then you said, put those orthotics back in. And I put them back in. I ran up and down. I came back to your table, and everything went weak again. And it was just mind blowing, at that point. And that's, I was already hooked, before that. But, can you explain just, how something like that can happen? And some people say orthotics are bad. It just, we're not getting into that concept right now, other than, what it was actually doing that was causing me to continue to shut down, and then just kind of redirecting that pain elsewhere.
Well, I think the biggest key is we have to understand that muscles move bones, and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. And so if we start looking for artificial forms of support, we're telling the muscles that, never mind, you don't need to do your job. We found some artificial way to help stabilize your foot. But the foot in itself, just this interrelationships of joint, the foot is what hits the ground. So it has to be a mobile adapter to be able to absorb shock and adapt to abnormal terrain. But then as the swing leg comes through, when you start to propel forward, it has to become a rigid lever. So the bones have to be at the right place at the right time. And when the foot hits the ground, all the muscles are placed that are loaded to the foot all the way up the chain are placed on a stretch. And once they're placed on a stretch, that allows them to store elastic energy to be able to recoil. And when you come to the propulsive phase of gait, those muscles support the arch stretch.
Hey,
and
Greg,
they're not going to be able to store
sorry.
elastic energy. So I got to transfer that. Ooh.
Yeah, no, you caught some delay there.
Okay.
So, if you want to just kind of go back a little bit, if you can, I don't know where it broke off, but
I hate to do this, but let me look at what this says. My eyes are so bad.
And go ahead.
So the main thing is we have to understand that muscles move bones, and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. And so when the muscles aren't being able to do their job, like if we put orthotics in somebody's shoes, we're basically saying, muscles, you know what, we don't need you. We found other ways to help support this foot. And so the first thing is that then, basically you put something to take away the motion that should occur at the foot. It's going to transfer the stress somewhere up the chain. And so a lot of times the orthotics can take away, like you said, initially it took away some Achilles tendonitis or plantar fasciitis, but all it did is redirect the stress. And I learned that early on because I was learning from the top specialists out there, and I was putting people in orthotics because I thought I understood how the body worked. But what I didn't understand early on was I didn't understand muscle function. And if the fact that muscles, when you think when that foot hits the ground, that foot hits and the arch has to collapse because it has to be a mobile adapter to help the body absorb shock and then adapt to abnormal terrain. But then as the swing leg comes through and you start to propel forward, the foot has to be a rigid lever so that you can propel forward over that big toe. And it's all about timing. At one point in time, the bones are all moving and it's a loose bag of bones. At another time, it's a rigid lever. And that's all due to muscle function because the muscles are placed under a stretch. When your foot hits the ground and the body weight comes crashing down, the muscles are placed under a stretch. And that allows them to store elastic energy so that when that swing leg comes through, you can release that stored energy and propel yourself forward. And that's what makes us so efficient in gait. It's that stretch recoil. It's like mini plyometrics. I mean, we're literally doing mini plyometrics when we walk.
Yep.
And so you need to allow the muscles to stretch and recoil. When you put somebody under some firm piece of plastic underneath somebody's foot, you've taken away the ability for the foot to become this loose bag of bones to adapt to abnormal terrain. And now you got forces transferring up the body saying, I need to absorb shock somehow. And you just took away one key component of function by putting an orthotic in the shoe.
Yep.
And so it's not as much when you hear about excessive pronators, it's not as much as pronation's bad. It's just, you know what, they're not strong enough in their muscle system to stretch and recoil and maintain. And
it's the timing, right? And
it's all about timing.
Yep.
It has to happen in like a millisecond, like from heel strike to same side heel strike occurs in less than a second. So you're pronating, supinating. I mean, and back-to-back feet, and then you hit the heel strike in less than a second again. You're hitting the same side heel. And that happens beyond our conscious control. So that goes back to the idea that muscles have to be able to contract and contract on demand because it happens without our conscious control because we don't even have time to think about it.
Yep.
And when you have stress, trauma, or overuse and the resultant inflammation, those timing mechanisms get off. So now all of a sudden they don't pronate and recoil and supinate in this short period. So now all of a sudden you're an excessive pronator. And that's only because your timing's off. And that timing can be muscles up the chain that are allowing everything to come crashing down through the foot, or it can be the timing off of the muscles of the feet that are supposed to stabilize hold the arch and then recoil through pronation and supination. So the timing can be off anywhere up the chain, but the end result will be excessive pronation.
Yep.
Excessive pronation is a weakness issue, not a structure issue.
Yeah.
So when somebody has an orthotic, they're trying to address the structure, not the muscle weakness. With muscle activation techniques, we're going to identify where the weaknesses are, address the weaknesses, and then people are no longer excessive pronators.
Yeah. And I've been without orthotics since with no none of those pains at all. So it's fantastic, you know. And one of the other things, you know, that always sticks into my mind going through it was this phrase that I think you had said was above the chain, below the chain, or another plane. And understanding that, you know, your excessive force is going to go somewhere and the issues are going to show up somewhere, and weird movement will show up either above that kinetic chain point, below it, or, you know, moving you into another plane, which really helped me identify, you know, as I'm looking at people or as I'm putting them on a table to see exactly where do I need to look as I'm starting to try to look at compensation. That's awesome, Greg.
Yeah. So the greatest thing about that is that exactly what you said. If you can't get motion in one joint, you'll pick that motion up at another joint that provides the same motion, or you'll pick it up about another axis, so in another plane of motion. And so the body has to compensate. I mean, we're going to get from point A to point B most efficiently with what we have to work with. And if you can't get motion in one area, you'll pick it up somewhere else because the body says, I still have to go where you asked me to go.
Yep.
And so I always say compensation is a good thing because you have to compensate to live life. If you have imbalances and muscle weaknesses, you're going to have to compensate for those weaknesses. But the problem is then it's like driving your car with bad alignment. The harder and faster you drive it, the faster it's going to break down.
Yep.
So compensation is a good thing, until you fix the problem.
It's like anything else. Excess of anything is going to turn into a problem at some point. Cool. All right, Greg, that was, fantastic. Just talking about the compensation and just, different ways that, you've found, to be able to test. And I think that is something that you've always talked about is, MAT is something that will always give you this checks and balances to work with whatever it is you want. So if you try to stretch somebody and you do the MAT before and after and the person's good, well, then the person's good and you feel safe within those realms. So, I also know that things have evolved a bit over the years. And would you mind explaining to people, kind of where kind of when it started to where you are today and how this thing has evolved and what you found along the way?
Yeah, so when I first put it together, it's kind of what we talked about. I realized that wherever there was a limitation in range of motion, it was an indicator that one or more of the muscles that cross the axis are potentially weak. And so that's how I started. I would just do the same range of motion or pretty muscle-specific range of motion exams with clients and identify where their limitations were. And I think it was cool at that point because I understood the integrated system, and I'm like, understanding this integrated process and knowing that the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, everything's interrelated. If somebody comes in with knee pain, where do I start? And so this process of saying actually range of motion is the most important tool, or the range of motion assessment is the most important tool you can have as an MAT practitioner, because wherever you see there's a limitation in range of motion, it's telling you something's wrong. And so I just followed this process of following range of motion and identifying muscle weaknesses through manual muscle testing, and then treating the weaknesses. And then all of a sudden, it's like I started seeing things that kind of were beyond the scope of what that process dictated. And I say that in a way that, I'd have people come in with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. And at the time when I'm developing this whole process, I'm working with the Utah Jazz, the Denver Broncos. I'm working with high-level athletes. And then I have somebody come in and it's like their body, it's like they're just shut down everywhere. Their body's weak and they're not athletic. And what I started to realize is when you put force on somebody's body, you have to determine whether or not their body can tolerate the forces. And so what used to be, I would put somebody back together. They'd come in a little broken down and it would be demonstrated by range of motion and then eventually pain if the problem wasn't addressed. That was the original aspect that I looked at. But then I'd send people away. And especially the more sensitive people or the people with lower tolerance levels, I guess you'd say. And I'd send those people away and they'd say, oh man, my knee's feeling better or my back's feeling better. And they'd come back the next week and say, you know what, my knee felt better for about a day. And then, I'm back to the same pain that I've always had. And I'm like, this is a little bit more complicated. And what I realized is, when people come in to see you, as an MAT practitioner, they're giving you a demonstration of the status of their neuromuscular system at that moment in time. So when they lay on the table, if they just got out of bed and they haven't put any physical stresses on their body, you'd say, oh, wow, they're actually doing pretty well. They're testing out pretty strong. They're pretty mobile and their body's not in this protective state. But if they came in and they just ran a marathon, you're going to have a whole different picture. And so what I realized is it's not about just putting people back together. It's about identifying their force tolerance levels and raising those force tolerance levels. Yeah. So one of the things that's evolved in the process, oh man, I got a phone ringing.
That's all right.
We're on vacation with the family in a hotel. And the hotel probably wants to know why we're not doing our demonstration.
That's awesome.
It's a timeshare.
Yeah. Oh, I hear you. I've been there.
I always want you to do your tour.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I forgot where I was going, but and the fact that it's about force tolerance, and one of the key questions behind MAT always was, well, how long will this hold? Mm-hmm. And on some people, it's like all they need, like athletes, just need a kickstart, and you reestablish, their neuromuscular function, and they go on and they do great. And somebody else could come in, and like I said, they come back the next day, and they come back and it's like, man, my knee, or the next week, and they say after a day my knee pain was gone. And so I realized that it's more about force tolerance, and that's where the range of motion exam even became more important, in the way that even though they didn't test weak in some of the muscle tests, there's a limitation in range of motion, and there's a limitation in range of motion for a reason. And I always say, I don't care what you can do, I want to know what you can't do, because what you can't do is breaking you down. And so if they can't turn their head to the right, or they can't rotate their arm back like they can on the other side, that's saying something's wrong with the muscles that function around that axis. And sometimes it's not just going to show up weak because they came in pretty rested. What's going to happen is the minute they go out and perform physical activity, that's when Pandora's box opens up. And so these limitations in range of motion that I would see on people are actually like, okay, there's a vulnerability here. And even though they're not testing weak, if I put a force on their body, we can determine whether or not they can tolerate those forces. We have to think about what forces mean. I mean, force is exercise, force is stretching, force is deep tissue massage, force is now the Theraguns and foam rolling and all of these new devices that are coming out in the exercise and rehab world. And we have to consider that we have to determine whether or not the body can tolerate the forces that we're putting on the body. And one of the things I said earlier is pain is one of the signs and symptoms of inflammation. And so when you put force on the body, i.e. deep tissue massage or a Theragun or foam rolling, and someone says, ooh, that hurts, I'm very tender there. Many times we think, oh, that's good, we need to loosen it up, we need to release it. What the body's really saying is, no, leave it alone. Because we're trying to heal. This tissue's damaged and it's inflamed and it's trying to heal. And so if there's inflammation and it's demonstrated through tenderness, that means the physical tolerance level of those muscles are a lot lower than a normal muscle. I mean, in an ideal situation, you could press on somebody's body and foam roll or deep tissue massage, and there wouldn't be any tenderness because there wouldn't be any inflammation. And so if there's tenderness and inflammation, then that's an area that the body's saying literally leave alone. Now, from a neuromuscular standpoint, what it's telling us as an MAT practitioner is that's an area we need to address to get to reestablish muscle activation, i.e. tighten the battery cables, and then those muscles can start to heal, almost kick them into the role in the growth and repair phase of inflammation and get them out of that acute state of inflammation. And so that's kind of where it's evolved is, okay, if there's a limitation in range of motion in a controlled environment, I could actually apply a stretch into those muscles, and that stretch is a force, which I know could cause inhibition. I could actually do massage or foam rolling or some form of force. And in a controlled environment, I can expose those vulnerabilities and weakness, then reestablish communication and treat the muscles to get them reactivated, i.e. again, tighten the battery cables. And then all of a sudden you send them away strong rather than weak. And that sets up the environment where those tissues can start to heal and recover. And so that's probably where it's progressed the most is in a controlled environment. I know I can use various forms of force that would typically shut them down in an uncontrolled environment and set them up for potential problems. But in a controlled environment, I would say we can fix what we break. We can break it down and expose the weakness and vulnerability, then reestablish communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And then it's like a vaccination. You teach your body how to tolerate that force.
Wow, that's fantastic. You know, one of the things too, to kind of switch it up slightly that, I'm seeing, and obviously with the emergence and success of Bryson Deshambo, who you work with, and utilizing, I thought that I had read utilizing machine-based training along with, the MAT and the things that you're doing and the performance that they're getting, which, nowadays that's, the common, perception out there is that the machines can't transfer. So I'd love for you to spend a little bit of time of what you're doing there. Obviously, guys, he carried 400 yards just recently. Yeah. I mean, come on, it's ridiculous. So I wouldn't mind, love, to share some of the stories that you can there and what you're doing with machine-based training and performance.
Yeah, and that's probably contradictory to where the industry has gone over the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, I talked about being in a functional training and learning from the best of the best in functional training from Gary Gray. And then now it's tied into myofascial training and I mean, the basically fascial chains and training the system as a whole. But the integrated system, or the way that I look at it from muscle activation technique standpoint, is the integrated system is only as good as the function of its isolated parts. And so literally with Bryson, what we've been doing is going movement by movement, muscle by muscle, and training all of his isolated parts and challenging. And that's when we talk about tolerance levels and thresholds. We've been challenging his thresholds and literally the term I used, a vaccination, creating a vaccination to the point where he can continue to tolerate greater amounts of force. So we use the exercise as part of the stress. It's a force on the body. And just as much as exercise can be a good thing, if the body can't recover from it and it can't heal, then it's actually part of can be contributing to inflammatory based issues. And we all know inflammation is the common denominator behind every disease out there. So if exercise becomes a stress where people can't get out of this chronically inflamed state, then exercise can be contributing to health issues rather than helping the health issues. And so at the highest level of health, we take somebody like Bryson and we say, well, let's challenge your tolerance levels movement by movement. And we put the force on him and we'll find that there's a certain amount of weight that he can lift. And he lifts that weight and forces it out, maxes out like trying to force that last rep, and it shuts him down. And there's specific movements for each, I guess there's in the highest level of MAT, there's 43 movement patterns that account for all the muscles in the body. And so I go, and this is called the MAT RX process. And in that process, I go through movement by movement, muscle by muscle to make sure that every movement that the body can move into, from spinal rotation to spinal flexion to side bend to spinal extension, and getting away from the core and then moving into the scapular motion and upward rotation, downward rotation, protraction, retraction. There's certain muscles that have the primary function to perform every movement that the body's capable of moving into. And so I basically challenge these movements through exercise. And once I exceed the tolerance level, it causes inhibition. And then through a specific process, it's not as simple as it sounds, but through a very specific process, we reestablish that neuromuscular function of all the muscles that associate to that movement. And then he can go back and do that exercise. And all of a sudden, he not only is he stronger at the exercise, but it doesn't shut him down or cause inhibition anymore. And so we've actually progressively taken him through each movement in his body. We've taken his tolerance levels in the last year and a half. I've documented the data, and every movement, if we took the main 21 movements, which don't involve the finger muscles of the fingers and toes, but involve the core, the shoulders, the hip muscles, the quads, the hamstring, if we took all of those muscles, he's doubled his strength levels in every single one of those movements since we started the process. And so that misconception that isolated training doesn't transfer into functional movement, the proof is in the pudding. He's the longest driver on the tour, and he hasn't done one squat, one deadlift, one power clean, any of the compound motions or any of the functional movement patterns that you would see in every gym out there. Everything he's done is through isolated strengthening. And when his trunk rotation strength is increased from the first time we challenged him, it was 90 pounds, and now he's doing 215 pounds for 5 repetitions. And I mean, different movement, every movement, he's doubled his strength levels, and from working from the core out. If he was only doing 20 pounds in external rotation of the shoulder, the humerus at the glenoid, now he's doing 40 pounds. And everything he's done, he's doubled in strength for his 5 rep max strength. And that's, I mean, and then again, now his driving distance and ball speed is transferred from that.
Well, again, obviously your system it's not just about putting people on machines and doing things. So it's bigger than that. But I remember back in the day, and it's amazing how much everything is just swung, reading Mel Siff Super Training and talking about, don't mimic the movement, with load. You're going to create different motor programs. Your brain's going to get confused, and then you're going to, pull on those motor programs as opposed to the ones that are required within the skill of the sport. So do your working out, and then, obviously go swing the golf club and use the club that you're going to use, has been the concept, and how we've moved, so radically one way or the other. But I guess that's just kind of how our world is right now anyway.
Yeah, that's the industry.
Yeah, we can't live in the middle. It's got to be the extremes.
Exactly.
So, well, can you go through, explaining, obviously you've got some various different courses, Greg. You've got, the Jumpstart stuff, and then you've got the basic internship, what that's called now, and then obviously the RX. Would you mind explaining what a trainer would get, or what a person would get from, going through the various courses?
Yeah, the MAT certification, I mean, literally what we call our specialist program is the foundational program. It's a year-long education program. I mean, that's traditionally what you went through back in 2001. And so that's a 10-month education program. It's 8 3-day weekends over a 10-month period where you learn anything and everything about muscle function, how to assess it, how to treat it. You learn everything about the anatomy and kinesiology of associated muscles and total body function. It's in depth. Yeah. And that's what we've traditionally taught for the last, since I started teaching it in probably 2000. Yep. But now we've had a lot of abbreviations, and one of them was I set up an introductory program, which is called the Jumpstart Program. And that Jumpstart program just teaches you the basic principles of MAT through upper body, lower body, and trunk and spine, and how to assess range of motion. And through using isometric contractions, you can actually reactivate the muscles through isometric contractions and kind of tie it in as a trainer. It's a great tool to tie into when you're working with your clients and say, oh man, they have a limitation in range of motion here. Let me do positional testing. We don't go into isolated testing. And let me do some positional testing, find out where there's positions of weakness, and then I can activate those positions of weakness through isometric contraction. A pretty straightforward process you can use on the spot while you're training your clients, and even all the way up. I taught the Seattle Mariners trainers, their whole staff, their trainers, strength coaches, medical professionals came through. We did a 2-year off-season program to train their whole staff in the MAT process, which was the total body, which would normally be the 10-month process. And probably the most important part that they were able to transfer was the jumpstart aspect, because they only get guys for like 5 or 10 minutes when you have player after player coming to you. And so they were able to use these introductory principles instead of being overwhelmed by the whole process and not being able to kind of thoroughly treat the athlete. So it's a great introductory program when you're trying to blend it in with all your other responsibilities as a trainer, therapist, whatever that may be. Well, that Jumpstart program is now, through COVID, I've actually written a book, and it's called Jumpstart into MAT. And so now it's not even a course where you have to attend. It's a book that's coming out. We're hoping by the first of the year. With COVID, we've had some delays. But we're hoping by the first of the year, we'll have that introductory program, which talks about all the foundational principles and the concepts behind MAT, and then gives you the tools to be able to start assessing and working with your client. So that's square one. The specialist program is level 2. I mean, basically the main education program, but we've even simplified that now, where you can break it down into, you can actually specialize in certain body part. So you can come in and learn lower body and just get certified as a lower body MAT specialist. We have upper body classes, trunk and spine coursework, then cervical spine, along with lower leg and foot and wrist and hand. So we have 4 main segments that people can come in and get certified in. If you're a medical professional and you specialize in the neck or shoulders, you can come in and just take that part of the body. If you're a trainer and you don't have any type of medical background, everyone has to start with at least taking the lower body class, because that's the easiest way to start being introduced to the concepts and start working with the hands-on skills that are required with the MAT process. But now you can get certified in segments of the body rather than having to be a full body specialist. But at the end of all 4 segments, if you complete all 4 and test out on all 4, you're a certified MAT practitioner.
Awesome.
Above and beyond that, we have master level, which is kind of the advanced level of the hands-on process and just takes you to another level, which is basically another level of every one of those body parts.
Yeah.
And then the RX process, which is what I call a total body overhaul, which looks at reprogramming the whole neuromuscular system. When you get these complicated clients that come in and their body's just a mess and chronically inflamed, they need a total body overhaul. And so that's where you go through these 43 patterns, movement by movement, muscle by muscle, to raise tolerance levels through the body to overall reduce inflammation and help to restore normal health.
And those are cumulative, meaning you have to go through the first, then go through the mastery, then get into RX.
Yeah, so it's a
Correct.
progressive approach, and they're all based off of the foundational principles. The range of motion leads to potential weakness. But the nice part is now is we've teamed up with Broadview University. And through Broadview, we actually have our courses regulated at the government level. We're actually a government-regulated education program where we can now offer degree programs. So
that's awesome.
Our specialist program, if you're fully certified through all sections of MAT, you can get a associate's degree. The master classes, when you complete all the master classes and test out, you can have get a bachelor's degree, and then the RX level would actually give you the opportunity to get a master's degree.
Wow.
And the positive about that is that one of the things, obviously, cost is an issue for education. Yeah. And to know that there's actually the opportunity where you could actually get financial aid and student loans because they are governmentally regulated and approved at the government level, we can actually offer financial assistance to our students.
So when the live stuff, where is that done? Or is it when you're doing it through the university?
So in the transfer from MAT, where it used to be the 8 3-day weekends over a 10-month period, the full-blown program, now we've switched it up where through Broadview, we've actually been able to create an online program, which is still the most important part of MAT is you have to get your hands on people.
Exactly.
To feel and touch. And so in these body part certifications, you do 12 weeks of online training. And then after the 12th week, you come in for a practical weekend in Denver. And it's a practical application weekend where you spend 2 days working on that aspect of the body. And then you test out for the certification for that body part. And so with each body part, it would be the same process where you go through 12 weeks of education followed by a practical application.
Beautiful. That's fantastic. And like I said before, I could be a testament of this is, how it's been able to separate me from anybody else in the gym that I work at or that I've ever worked. I mean, at one time when we hosted it in the Burr Ridge Club, we had 5 of us that were all working there, which was fantastic. But at the end of the day, to have that unique skill to be able to help somebody feel better almost instantly. And again, obviously it doesn't always happen that way, but I've had my fair share of just working on somebody who's had, bad plantar fasciitis forever. And in a couple of sessions it went away, and, it doesn't always happen like that, but when you get lucky and it does, it's fantastic. And, that reputation just ripples. And, between what you can charge, obviously helps you, and the longevity of being a true specialist in a niche that, not a lot of people have is just phenomenal for people to hopefully take and run with it. And I think every one of us that went through it, when I started, even through the Burr Ridge days, have gone on to see some great success in their careers in many different avenues, as well. So I can't thank you enough for really being truly the guy who's changed my mind in this industry. And I've been lucky enough to learn from a lot of people, but your stuff is completely just, taken me to another game and made me look at the body differently. And God, I'm just so happy to see how well you're doing in the success that is happening.
Well, that's great to hear, and you said it perfectly. I mean, there's nothing better, and when you're doing a job to say, "Wow, I was actually able to help somebody," and when they're coming to you, I mean, pain. I mean, you can't put a price on health, and I've seen so many clients of our practitioners over the years that have claimed the success that they've achieved by, which is interesting, through improving neuromuscular function. And that's, I mean, probably the keys is, I mean, if you come from the exercise realm, we're exercise specialists. And I say from an MAT standpoint, we're muscle specialists in the way that, I mean, if your car breaks down, you're going to take it to a mechanic and have them look under the hood to figure out what's going on. And the same thing from an MAT standpoint is when the body starts to break down, who better to take it to than a muscle specialist? And now that we have these degreed education programs, I mean, I feel like we're where chiropractic, I used to say we were where chiropractic was maybe 100 years ago, but now I believe we're like where they were 50 years ago, where we're basically, now people can get degreed educations and it's government regulated, that now we can say, I mean, the same way there's a chiropractor, or massage therapist, or physical therapist on every corner in every city, in every state, in every country. Eventually there should be somebody doing MAT in every corner in every city, in every state, because if we ask who's MAT for, anyone with a muscle system. And that's everybody.
And that brings up one last question, I think is, you know, I had it in my head and then I lost it, but it came back here is, you know, so often through my career, I've gone to a doctor or a chiro and said, hey, you know, I've got a background in muscle activation. And they're like, yeah, I do muscle activation. And I'm like, oh, so, you know, have you gone through Greg's classes? And who's Greg? And I'm like, okay, wait. So what do you do? So would you be able to spend just a couple minutes of, you know, why people say I do muscle activation, but the difference between activating muscles and then the system, obviously, of muscle activation technique that you
and you hear it every day, especially in the fitness industry and the rehab industry. I mean, I'll hear people, oh, here's a glute activation exercise. And I would say, how do you know? I mean, if you don't have the tools to be able to assess that the glutes were even shut down, I mean, how do you even know whether or not the exercise can activate muscles? And so the term muscle activation is used pretty loosely. And so I just look at it, especially now that this is a degreed and government, I mean, accepted program. If it's not, it doesn't have the MAT logo and trademark next to it, then it's not MAT. And you can't guarantee that they're actually activating muscles. And it's not a systematic process. That's specific. I mean, to literally, the principles of MAT are what I've protected since I developed it 20 years ago, and then all the way to the RX level. I just recently got the approved patent for these 43 movement patterns that make up this neuromuscular hierarchy. And so the system is the key. The term can be used loosely, but the systematic process that basically makes up the foundational principles of MAT are what differentiate it from anyone else that's throwing out those terms in the exercise or rehab industry. And it's a very methodical process that we go through to be able to identify neuromuscular dysfunction and then to be able to reestablish that neuromuscular function. So I would ask that, have you gone through the full certifications? Do you have the certifications to validate that you're actually doing muscle activation?
Well, and I could tell you, you know, I always said there was learning anatomy and physiology and biomechanics. And then I came to your class, and then like when you have to find it on the body and actually go and palpate it, it's a whole nother level, but it, you know, again, it's elevated me up. So
real world anatomy and kinesiology.
So anything else that you have to share, man? It's been a pleasure, and I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours.
I think the greatest thing, and probably an example of how you're talking, is it's helped you in situations you've gone in routes in management and probably not always on the floor doing the training side of it, but you've always had this distinctive skill that separated you from other people in the health and fitness industry. And I think that's the key, regardless of whether someone's a trainer, a therapist, a chiropractor. It gives a unique skill that you can never take away. And I think that's probably the key, is if we're saying who's the process for to get treated, it's everyone with a muscle system, but who is the education program for? It's for trainers, therapists, chiropractors, massage therapists, athletic trainers. I've found that we've had people come from every field, and then it helps to separate them in the industry. Yeah. And so regardless of whether you do it in every day, and it's what you make as a career, it's always something you can fall back on. Yeah. But even if you don't make it a career, you always have skills and tools that differentiate you from anyone else in your field. Yeah. And I think that's pretty unique, because then it doesn't make us competition. I'm not competing with physical therapists. I'm not competing with trainers. I'm not competing. I'm coming to everyone in the health and exercise field and saying, I'm bringing a tool that can help you help other people with the skills and implement it in the skills you already have. And MAT works as an adjunct in what you do rather than working against what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. And I think one thing that you've got, your humbleness is, if that's a word, of staying within that, because I think, what I've seen over the years, a lot of times, is people go and learn this, they haven't learned anything else. And then they tear other people down. I always said I was fortunate enough and lucky enough to have the money and to have the time to be able to do it. And if you start to communicate with these people and you teach them what they don't know without punching it in their face with it, it's going to be a much better process where you're going to end up getting referrals, which I did. I'm going to end up getting referrals from the trainers because they know I'm not taking their clients. I'm going to give them back and say, here's some recommendations. Where I've also seen it the other way, where the trainers just kind of, the MAT guy will come after them a little bit, and then it'll negate it. And then there's no relationship. Yeah. So, it's been such a great ride, and,
yeah.
Amazing.
It's funny. I'll jump on that. And you brought up the name, and just to put it in perspective, I mean, before social media, before the world got to be what it is today with the internet and everything, Mel Siff publicly attacked me when I first came out. I was working with the Broncos and first came out and started teaching MAT principles. And Mel Siff, who wrote the book Super Training, he was from Denver. And he publicly attacked me. I
didn't know that.
Kendall's work and everything. And so we ended up meeting at a convention in Toronto, and we ended up sitting down, having a beer and talking. And for him to really question and actually feel out what the whole process and principles were, and he ended up apologizing and saying, I had no clue. I just heard you were doing muscle testing, and I just thought you were taking other people's work and reproducing it in the exercise field. And literally I'd been to his house. My wife and I have been to his house and worked on him a few times, and it opened his eyes to a whole nother world of function and how it related to exercise. I mean, this was one of the top specialist exercise physiologists out there, and it opened up a whole world to him about the idea that muscles aren't always prepared for the exercise, and so what could have been a conflict became a good relationship. Well, I mean, he unfortunately died not too long afterwards, but it became a good relationship, respectful relationship, and but it was funny. I mean,
I had no idea.
Yeah. Yeah, the first thing is the hair can go up on people's back. I mean, it's been out long enough that I probably have less confrontation. But back then, 20 years ago, I was the only one doing it.
Yep.
I was throwing around principles that nobody had really talked about. Now, 20 years later, now, I mean, we've had a couple thousand people go through the whole certification program, and I mean, it's evolved so much that everywhere I go, if I have an MAT shirt on, people will say, "Oh, do you do MAT?"
Yeah. Yeah, that's me. Well,
so it's been interesting to see how it's all grown. But what I was going to say, I guess the final point on that, and it's because of people like you that have come through the program, is every student that's ever come through the program has been a representation of the process. And if those people didn't go out and represent it well, we wouldn't have ground to stand on. And it's through everybody helping other people that has made this, helped this to continue to grow.
Wow, man, I appreciate it so much. And again, thank you for taking time off, of your vacation to be able to record this. So the best wishes to you and your family and everyone else, and continued success. And I got to get myself back into a couple of the classes to get refreshed up too. Thanks so much, Greg, for sure.
Right.
Have a great day.
You too.